The winter storm hit without warning, turning the streets of Eastbridge into rivers of ice and shadow. Henry Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his stalled Mercedes, watching the dashboard lights flicker and die. His daughter Audrey sat beside him, her small body trembling beneath her designer coat, lips turning blue in the bitter cold. She pressed her face against the frosted window, and through the swirling snow, her eyes found something that made her forget the hunger gnawing at her stomach. A tiny bakery glowed like a lighthouse in the darkness, its windows displaying a single chocolate cake adorned with delicate white frosting. Inside, Serafina Lane looked up from her empty register and recognized the man stepping through her door, the coldest billionaire in the city, the man who had crushed countless small businesses without blinking. She should have turned him away. Instead, she reached for a cake box and placed the chocolate cake inside, handing it to the shivering child without a word. Henry watched his daughter smile for the first time in months, and something cracked inside his frozen heart. He glanced at the weathered sign above the door as they stepped back into the cold. Serafina Lane Bakery. The name echoed in his mind like a warning bell, because he suddenly realized this tiny shop sat directly in the path of his newest development project. In 2 weeks, this building would be demolished to make way for luxury condominiums. The woman who had just saved his daughter would lose everything because of him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the glass conference room of Hayes Capital. Henry stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, his expression carved from stone. Around him sat the most powerful executives in the city, and not one of them dared to meet his eyes. Carter Voss, his chief operating officer, pulled up the presentation slides with practiced efficiency. The Eastbridge redevelopment project sprawled across the screen in bold letters, accompanied by architectural renderings of sleek towers rising from the ashes of the old neighborhood. "We need to close this deal within 14 days, Henry said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Every delay costs us $300,000. The investors are getting restless, and I won't have Archie Cole breathing down my neck because we couldn't handle a few stubborn shopkeepers." Carter nodded, a thin smile playing on his lips. "I've already drafted the final acquisition notices. The remaining businesses will receive their eviction papers by end of week. Most of them can barely afford their rent anyway. They'll fold without a fight." Henry's gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Silas Monroe, the company's legal counsel. Silas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his pen tapping against his notepad in a nervous rhythm that betrayed his unease. "Something to add?" Henry asked, his tone dangerous. Silas cleared his throat. "Some of the compensation offers seem below market value. There could be legal complications if legal complications are what I pay you to prevent." Henry interrupted coldly. "Sentiment doesn't pay dividends. Silas, this company wasn't built on kindness. Remember that." The meeting ended, and Henry retreated to his corner office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he had spent 2 decades conquering. Every building in his line of sight represented a battle won, a competitor crushed, a dream realized through sheer force of will. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he thought of Audrey, of the way she had clutched that cake box like it contained all the warmth in the world. He thought of the tired woman behind the counter who had nothing but still gave everything. At that same moment, Audrey sat alone in the breakfast room of their sprawling mansion, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate with her silver fork. The house was beautiful and lifeless, filled with expensive furniture that no one ever touched, and silence that pressed against her ears like cotton. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed miles away. Original paintings lined walls that had never heard laughter. It was a museum, not a home. "Would you like something sweet, Miss Audrey?" the housekeeper asked gently. "Some pastries from the French bakery, perhaps." Audrey shook her head, her small fingers tracing the edge of a crayon drawing tucked beneath her placemat. It showed a figure that might have been her mother, standing in a kitchen filled with sunshine and the smell of fresh bread. A memory, or perhaps just a wish. She couldn't remember anymore which was which. The colors were fading, just like the memories themselves. Henry passed through the room on his way out, barely slowing his stride. "Be good today," he said without looking at her. "I'll be home late." Audrey nodded, swallowing the words she wanted to say. She had learned long ago that her father didn't have time for feelings. He barely had time for her. The door closed behind him, and she was alone again with the silence and the paintings and the cold perfection of it all. She wondered if this was what it felt like to be invisible, across the city, in the cramped kitchen of her bakery. Serafina counted the day's earnings for the third time, hoping the numbers might somehow change. They didn't. The register held exactly $47.63, barely enough to cover her electricity bill. The rent was already 2 months overdue, and the ancient oven had started making sounds that suggested it might give up entirely before spring arrived. Each clunk and wheeze felt like a countdown. She wiped flour from her hands and stared at the cracks spreading across the ceiling like veins. This bakery had been her grandmother's dream, then her mother's burden, and now her own beautiful disaster. Every morning she woke at 4 to knead dough and shape pastries, and every night she fell asleep wondering if tomorrow would be the day the doors closed forever. The recipes were sacred, the memories were priceless, but neither could pay the bills that piled on her counter like snow. The bell above the entrance chimed, and Matilda Crane walked in with the confidence of someone who owned the building, which she did. Serafina. Matilda's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I trust you have my rent." "I need 2 more weeks," Serafina said, hating the desperation in her own voice. "Business has been slow with the construction blocking the street, but once the holidays come—" "Holidays?" Matilda laughed, a cold sound that matched the weather outside. "Honey, there won't be any holidays for this little shop. I've already had offers from developers, big offers, the kind that make your overdue rent look like pocket change. This bakery has been here for 40 years. Your grandmother is dead, and sentiment doesn't pay my mortgage." Matilda set a document on the counter with a sharp click. "You have until the end of the month. Pay in full, or start packing. The choice is yours." After she left, Serafina turned on the small television mounted in the corner, needing noise to drown out her thoughts. A news anchor's voice filled the room, cheerful and oblivious to the pain happening in kitchens like hers across the city. In business news, billionaire Henry Hayes announced expansion plans for his East Bridge redevelopment project, promising to transform one of the city's oldest neighborhoods into a modern commercial district. Critics say the project will displace hundreds of low-income residents, but Hayes Capital maintains that progress requires sacrifice. Serafina stared at the screen, at the face of the man who had stood in her bakery just hours ago, the man whose daughter she had fed, the man who was about to destroy everything she had left. His eyes looked cold even through the television screen, empty, like windows into a house where no one lived anymore. Her hands trembled as she switched off the television. That evening, the storm returned with renewed fury. Henry had no choice but to bring Audrey to a dinner meeting with Archie Cole, one of his most important investors. The nanny had called in sick, and leaving a 7-year-old alone in that empty mansion felt wrong even to him. Besides, Archie had a soft spot for children. It would be good for appearances. The Mercedes purred through downtown traffic until they reached the outskirts of Eastbridge, where the roads narrowed and the streetlights grew sparse. Henry took a shortcut through the old neighborhood, a route he had driven 100 times in daylight but never in weather like this. That's when the engine stuttered, coughed, and died. He tried the ignition again. Nothing. The dashboard remained dark. The heater fell silent, and within minutes, the cold began seeping through the windows like poison. "Stay calm," Henry muttered, more to himself than to Audrey. He pulled out his phone, but the storm had knocked out cell service across half the city. No signal, no rescue, no backup plan. For the first time in years, Henry Hayes was completely out of control. "Daddy," Audrey's voice was small. "I'm cold." Henry looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in months. Her face was pale, her teeth chattering despite the cashmere coat that cost more than most families' monthly grocery bills. She wasn't complaining, wasn't crying, just sitting there trying to be brave because she had learned that weakness made her father uncomfortable. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She was mimicking him, hiding her feelings, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. She was 7 years old, and she had already learned to suppress everything that made her human. He had taught her that, without saying a word. He had taught her that feelings were dangerous and vulnerability was shameful. "Come here," he said roughly, pulling off his own coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. The cold bit into him immediately, but he barely noticed. "We'll walk until we find somewhere warm." They stumbled through the snow, past boarded-up storefronts and darkened windows. This neighborhood had once been vibrant, filled with families and small businesses and the kind of community that looked out for each other. Now it looked like a war zone. Casualties of progress scattered across every block. For sale signs hung in windows. Eviction notices fluttered in the wind. The streets that had once held block parties and children's laughter now held only silence and snow. Audrey's steps grew slower. Her breathing labored. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the cold was sapping what little energy she had left. "Daddy," she whispered, "I'm hungry." Henry had no answer. In his world of private chefs and five-star restaurants, he had forgotten what hunger felt like. He had forgotten a lot of things. He had forgotten what it meant to need something you couldn't buy. He had forgotten what it meant to be helpless. Then the smell reached them, butter and sugar and something warm, carried on the frozen wind like a promise. Audrey stopped walking, her eyes fixed on a glow in the distance. The bakery. They pressed their faces against the glass, and Audrey pointed at a small chocolate cake in the display case with trembling fingers. "It's so pretty," she breathed, fog forming on the window from her words. Henry hesitated. He knew who owned this shop. He knew what his company planned to do to it. But Audrey's lips were turning blue, and the warmth beyond that door called to him like a siren song. Pride and principle meant nothing when your child was freezing. He pushed open the door. Serafina looked up from behind the counter, and her expression shifted from welcoming to guarded in the span of a heartbeat. She recognized him immediately. Everyone in Eastbridge knew the face of Henry Hayes. His picture had been in the newspaper just last week, standing in front of a demolished building with a shovel in his hand, smiling like he had won a war. "We're about to close," she said flatly. Henry opened his mouth to respond, but Audrey had already spotted the chocolate cake, and the longing in her eyes was impossible to ignore. It wasn't greed, it wasn't entitlement. It was something purer than that, something that reminded Serafina of herself at that age, when her grandmother's kitchen had been the safest place in the world, when a slice of cake could fix anything. Serafina watched the child, taking in the chattering teeth, the red-rimmed eyes, the way she pressed herself against her father's leg as if trying to absorb any warmth he might offer. This was not a child accustomed to wanting things she couldn't have. This was a child who had never known cold like this, hunger like this, desperation like this. And yet here she was, just as vulnerable as any other 7-year-old in the world. And despite everything, despite knowing exactly who Henry Hayes was and what he represented, Serafina found herself reaching for a cake box. "This one didn't sell today," she said, the lie coming easily. It was her best seller. She had turned away 3 customers who wanted it. "If nobody takes it, I'll just have to throw it away. Would you like it, sweetheart?" Audrey's eyes went wide. "Really? You mean it?" Serafina nodded, adding a handful of napkins to the box. "You should get somewhere warm soon. This storm isn't letting up." The child took the box with reverent hands, as if receiving a holy relic. Then she looked up at Serafina with an expression that made the baker's chest tighten. "Thank you," Audrey whispered. "You look tired. Please don't be sad. Okay?" Serafina blinked, caught off guard by the simple observation. When was the last time anyone had noticed she was tired? When was the last time anyone had cared enough to say something? Certainly not the customers who complained about prices. Certainly not the landlord who demanded rent. Certainly not the city officials who ignored her permit applications. A 7-year-old stranger had seen her more clearly in 5 seconds than most people had in 5 years. Henry reached for his wallet, extracting several $100 bills. "Let me pay you for no." Serafina pushed the money back across the counter. "I gave it to her, not to you." Their eyes met, and something passed between them. A challenge, a recognition. 2 people standing on opposite sides of an invisible line, each refusing to step back. Henry took the cake box from Audrey's hands only long enough to guide her toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. "Why?" he asked quietly. "You know who I am. You know what I've done." Serafina's smile was sad, tinged with something that might have been pity. "I know who you are. I also know a hungry child when I see one. Now go, before you freeze." They found shelter at a small motel 2 blocks away, where Henry paid cash for a room with a working heater. The carpet was stained and the wallpaper was peeling, but the radiator worked and the beds were clean. Audrey sat cross-legged on the mattress, eating the chocolate cake with slow, deliberate bites, savoring each one as if afraid the sweetness might disappear. "This is the best cake I've ever had," she announced. Henry watched her, a strange heaviness settling in his chest. He had bought his daughter countless desserts from the finest patisseries in the world, birthday cakes that cost thousands of dollars, imported chocolates from Belgium, custom-made confections from celebrity chefs who charged more per hour than most people earned in a week. None of them had ever made her smile like this. "That lady was nice," Audrey continued, oblivious to her father's turmoil. "She gave me the cake even though she's poor." "How do you know she's poor?" Audrey shrugged. Her shop was small and cold, like she couldn't afford the heater, but she still gave me something. She paused, considering. "That's what Mommy would have done." The mention of Adelaide hit Henry like a punch to the stomach. His wife had been dead for 3 years, taken by a car accident that had left him with a daughter he didn't know how to love and a heart he had encased in ice to survive the grief. Adelaide had been warm, soft. She used to bake bread on Sunday mornings, filling their home with scents that made it feel alive. Henry had told her once that she was too soft for this world, too kind, too trusting. "You'll get hurt," he had warned her. "People take advantage of kindness." She had just smiled and kissed his forehead. "Maybe, but I'd rather be hurt than become someone who can't feel at all." And then she was gone. And he had decided that kindness was weakness, that caring was dangerous, that the only way to protect yourself was to feel nothing at all.
He had built walls so high that even his own daughter couldn't climb them.
But tonight, a stranger had given his daughter warmth without asking for anything in return, and it had cost Serafina far more than it had cost him. The next morning, Henry sat in his home office, staring at a list of properties scheduled for demolition. Serafina Lane Bakery was near the top. Carter called at 8 o'clock sharp. "We need your signature on the final acquisition documents. The bakery owner is the last holdout. Once she's gone, we can break ground next month." Henry stared at the papers in front of him. His pen hovered over the signature line. He thought of Audrey's smile. He thought of the tired woman behind the counter who had nothing but still gave everything. He thought of Adelaide, and what she would have said if she could see what he had become. "I'll review them later," he said, and hung up before Carter could argue. He found himself driving back to Eastbridge, though he couldn't explain why. He parked down the street from the bakery and walked the rest of the way, dressed in jeans and a simple jacket, trying to blend in with the neighborhood. Serafina was arranging pastries in the display case when he entered. Her expression hardened immediately. "You again." Henry set an envelope on the counter. "I wanted to pay for the cake properly, and to thank you." "I told you, I don't want your money." "Then what do you want?" The question hung in the air between them. Serafina set down the croissant she'd been holding and met his gaze directly, her brown eyes blazing with an intensity that made him want to look away. "I want you to leave this neighborhood alone. I want you to stop buying up buildings and pushing out families who've lived here for generations. I want you to care about something other than profit margins." She laughed bitterly. "But we both know that's not going to happen, so I'll settle for you leaving my shop." Before Henry could respond, the door burst open. Matilda Crane strode in, followed by a man carrying a locksmith's toolkit.
"Change of plans," Matilda announced cheerfully. "I've found a buyer for the building. You have 72 hours to vacate." Serafina's face went white. "You said I had until the end of the month." That was before Hayes Capital offered triple the market value. Matilda smiled at Henry. "Your company works fast." "Mr. Hayes, I'm impressed." Henry felt the blood drain from his own face. He hadn't authorized this. He hadn't even known about it. But the damage was already done. Serafina was looking at him with an expression of pure betrayal, as if every word she had spoken about him had just been proven true. "Get out," she whispered. "Both of you, get out of my shop." That night, Henry called an emergency meeting with his executive team. Carter arrived looking smug, Bernie Knox trailing behind with his tablet already open to monitor social media reactions. "I didn't authorize the accelerated acquisition of the bakery property," Henry said, his voice dangerously calm. "Explain." Carter spread his hands. "You said you wanted the project completed on schedule. I took initiative. You went behind my back. I did what needed to be done. That woman was never going to sell willingly. Now we don't have to wait." Henry studied his COO, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The ambition behind the professional smile, the willingness to cut corners, bend rules, hurt people all in the name of progress. How many times had Henry looked the other way? How many families had been displaced while he focused on spreadsheets and stock prices? How many lives had been destroyed by men who told themselves they were just doing what needed to be done? "We're pausing the acquisition," Henry said. "Effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. Carter's smile froze on his face. Bernie nearly dropped his tablet. Even Silas, who had been taking notes in the corner, looked up in shock. "You can't be serious," Carter said. "Archie Cole will have your head. The board answers to me." Henry's voice left no room for argument. I want a full audit of every compensation offer we've made in Eastbridge, every signature, every document, every transaction. If I find anything irregular, there will be consequences." He left the room without waiting for a response, but he could feel Carter's eyes boring into his back like daggers. This wasn't over. They both knew it. The next morning, photographs appeared online. Henry Hayes standing in a tiny bakery. Henry Hayes talking to a woman in a flour-dusted apron. The headlines wrote themselves. "Billionaire's secret lover," one tabloid screamed. "Hayes Capital CEO spotted in Eastbridge slum," declared another. "Corporate raider falls for small business owner," suggested a third. Bernie's damage control machine kicked into high gear, spinning the story as a charitable visit. But the damage was done, within hours. Serafina's bakery had become the center of a media firestorm that burned far beyond anyone's control. Some people defended her as a hard-working small business owner standing up to corporate greed. Others attacked her as a gold digger trying to extract money from a wealthy man. The truth didn't matter. Perception was everything, and perception had been weaponized against her. Someone threw a brick through her window that night. The message scrawled on the attached paper was crude and vicious, accusing her of crimes she hadn't committed and suggesting punishments no one deserved. When Henry heard about the vandalism, he sent George, his personal bodyguard, to watch the shop from across the street. He arranged for the window to be repaired by a crew that arrived before dawn. He did everything he could think of to help, short of showing his face. It wasn't enough. Audrey asked about the bakery lady every day. "Is she okay? Daddy, did something happen to her? Can we visit her?" Finally, Henry relented and drove her back to Eastbridge, where they found Serafina sweeping broken glass from her front step, her face drawn and tired. "I made you something," Audrey said, holding out a hand-drawn card decorated with crayon flowers and hearts. The letters spelled out, "Thank you for the warm cake." Serafina took the card with trembling hands. Her eyes glistened as she read the childish words, so simple and so sincere. "Do you get scared?" Audrey asked suddenly. Serafina knelt down to meet the child's eyes. "Sometimes, yes. But you still gave me the cake, even though you were scared." "I was scared of many things, sweetheart. Scared of losing my shop. Scared of what people would think. Scared of tomorrow." She glanced up at Henry, and something shifted in her expression. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But perhaps the beginning of understanding. But being kind is never the wrong choice, even when it costs you. A woman appeared behind them, notebook in hand, camera hanging around her neck. Callista Drake, investigative journalist, known for exposing corporate corruption. Her smile was sharp as a blade. "Serafina Lane, I've been investigating the Eastbridge acquisitions for months. I think your story deserves to be told." Her gaze slid to Henry. "All of it." Over the following days, the pressure mounted from every direction. Callista's preliminary article raised troubling questions about Hayes Capital's business practices in Eastbridge. Archie Cole demanded answers, threatening to pull his investment if Henry didn't get the situation under control. The board scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss his leadership. But it was Finn Morrison, a mechanic who ran a garage near the bakery, who finally opened Henry's eyes to the full scope of what had been happening in his name. "You want to know the truth," Finn said, wiping grease from his hands as they stood in his cluttered workshop. "Your company's been squeezing this neighborhood for years. People get letters saying they have to sell, and if they refuse, suddenly there are health inspections, permit violations, problems with their insurance, all very official, all very legal, and all designed to break them." "I didn't know." "Didn't you?" Finn's laugh was humorless. "Or did you just not want to Ingrid Walsh?" a social worker who had spent 20 years serving Eastbridge families, told Henry similar stories. Elderly residents forced from their homes with nowhere to go. Children pulled from schools when their families couldn't afford to relocate. A community being dismantled piece by piece, family by family, dream by dream. "Your name is on those documents," she said quietly. "Whether you signed them yourself or not, you're responsible."
Henry met with Silas in secret, in a coffee shop far from the office and Carter's watching eyes. "I need everything," Henry said. "Every acquisition file from the past 5 years, every compensation record, every email, every memo." Silas hesitated. "If Carter finds out I'm helping you, Carter won't find out. And if what I suspect is true, he's going to have bigger problems than office politics." The evidence came together slowly, each piece damning on its own but devastating in combination. Carter had been falsifying documents for years, lowering compensation offers, forging signatures, using Henry's authority to crush anyone who resisted. The profits had been substantial, the human cost incalculable. But the most important piece of evidence came from an unexpected source: Serafina's old security camera, forgotten in a corner of her shop, had recorded everything that happened inside those walls, including a visit from Carter himself 3 weeks earlier, when he had personally threatened to destroy her if she didn't sell. "You don't have a choice," Carter's voice said on the grainy footage. "Sign the papers, or we'll bury you. Your credit will be destroyed. Your permits will be revoked. By the time we're done, you won't be able to get a job cleaning toilets in this city." Henry watched the recording with cold fury building in his chest. This was what his empire had become. This was what he had allowed to happen while he hid behind his grief and his boardroom walls. Carter struck first, orchestrating a vote of no confidence in the board. He positioned himself as the steady hand that would guide Hayes Capital through troubled times. Archie Cole supported him publicly. Bernie Knox leaked damaging stories about Henry's mental state, suggesting the CEO had become emotionally unstable, unfit for leadership. The health inspector returned to Serafina's bakery, accompanied by 2 police officers. They cited dozens of violations, most of them fabricated or exaggerated beyond recognition, and ordered the shop closed immediately. Serafina stood in her empty bakery that night, surrounded by years of memories. The recipes her grandmother had taught her, the regulars who had become like family, the smell of fresh bread that had defined her entire life. It was gone, all of it. She was packing the last of her supplies when headlights swept across the windows. Henry stepped out of his car, alone, shoulders hunched against the cold. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt inadequate. They were inadequate, but they were all he had. "Sorry doesn't reopen my shop." "No, but the truth might." He handed her a folder thick with documents. "Everything Carter did. Everything I should have stopped. It's all here. And tomorrow, I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The city council meeting was standing room only. Residents of Eastbridge filled the seats, their faces reflecting years of anger and frustration. Reporters lined the walls with cameras ready. Archie Cole sat in the front row, arms crossed, smirking. Carter took the podium first, presenting himself as the voice of reason. "Hayes Capital remains committed to the Eastbridge project, despite recent distractions. We will deliver on our promises to this community." Then Henry stood. "I've spent 20 years building an empire," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I told myself I was creating progress. I told myself the sacrifices were necessary. I told myself that sentiment had no place in business." He looked at Audrey, sitting in the second row beside Serafina. His daughter's eyes were fixed on him with an expression he had never seen before. Hope. "I was wrong, and I have proof." The evidence played across the council's screens. Emails, documents, the security footage from Serafina's bakery. Carter's face went white as his own voice filled the chamber, threatening and cruel. Silas presented the legal analysis. Callista's article went live simultaneously, shared across every news outlet in the city. The case against Carter was overwhelming and undeniable, but it was Audrey who delivered the final blow. "The lady at the bakery gave me a cake when I was hungry," she said, standing on her seat so everyone could see her. "She was poor and scared, but she was still nice to me. People like that shouldn't be kicked out of their homes. They should be protected." The room fell silent. Then, slowly, the applause began. Carter was escorted out by security, his empire of lies crumbling around him. Bernie Knox fled before anyone could question him.